Is true lasting world peace even possible? I mean, it's a goal humanity has striven for, dreamed of, definitely debated. But is it just a utopian fantasy or maybe a practical possibility that's just out of reach?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that.
Yeah.
It's incredibly complex. We've gathered, well, a fascinating stack of sources for you. Everything from a really thought-provoking Reddit discussion about, believe it or not, a superhero solving global conflict,
Ah, right. That was an interesting one.
all the way to dense academic theories on international relations and detailed analyses of global power dynamics, economic interdependence, the whole shebang.
And our mission today really is to unpack the core ideas behind conflict and cooperation. We want to identify some of the surprising factors that drive international stability, maybe offer you a shortcut to understanding why peace is so elusive.
But maybe not entirely out of reach.
Perhaps not entirely. They're ready for some potential aha moments along the way.
Okay, let's kick this off with that thought experiment you mentioned. It's kind of classic. Imagine a super being, immense power, almost godlike. Could they just force world peace? Snap their fingers.
Well, it's compelling, isn't it? And that Reddit discussion we looked at posed it directly. Could a superhuman bring total world peace if he really wanted to, without being associated with any government or military?
Right.
And the challenges people brought up immediately were, well, they were pretty stark.
Absolutely. I mean, even if you have super senses, you can outrun missiles, shoot them down.
Yeah.
Physical force alone can't actually change minds, can it? Or fix the underlying grievances that cause conflict in the first place.
No, exactly.
There was this one grim suggestion that this super might have to kill like 1 million people each day just to enforce their demands.
Which is horrifying.
It leads to enormous casualties, destruction of property. Honestly, that kind of peace sounds much worse than war.
It's a truly dystopian vision. And the discussion, highlights the core issue, doesn't it? That kind of brute force. It risks just replacing current governments with something potentially much worse.
Like a dictatorship.
Yeah, a dictatorship rife with unrest, freedom fighters, corruption, and fear. What's fascinating, though, is how quickly that online conversation shifted from just raw physical power to the, complexities of human nature, political systems. It really gets to that fundamental question. Can peace truly be forced?
And it got even more nuanced when they talked about social influence. The thread brought up this idea that the super being wouldn't just be physically strong, but could inspire, like cults,
Right.
and make governments lose social points, quote unquote,
Yeah.
just by trying to fight them. They even compared it to, was it Homelander?
Yeah, from The Boys,
Yeah.
noting his intelligence and social influencing ability.
Right, suggesting that the super being's social pull could make them more invincible than his powers because we're already so divided. What does that tell us about power itself, even without superheroes?
Well, that's the real revelation, I think, from that thought experiment. It's not just that physical power fails. It's that true, lasting peace. It has to be built on something fundamentally human,
Like what?
like a shift in motivations, maybe redefining self-interest, a willingness to overcome fear. Even godlike force can't just override free will or, the deep-seated divisions that drive conflict.
So the core takeaway is that raw power, even superhuman power, just can't change human motivations or those complex dynamics of fear and self-interest between states.
Precisely. It sets the stage nicely, actually.
Okay, so if brute force, even superpowered brute force, is a dead end for peace, what do the big established frameworks of international relations tell us? The ones built on centuries of human history. Let's turn to realism.
Ah, realism. Yeah,
It seems to start from a similar place as the superhero idea, right? Human nature.
it does, yeah. Realism, at its heart, is a pretty stark view of the world. It goes way back to thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who famously described life, in the state of nature at least, as the war of all against all.
Right. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. And realism basically argues that states, much like individuals in that state of nature, are primarily driven by self-preservation. They see the international arena not as a place for cooperation necessarily, but as a kind of battleground.
And this leads to some, well, pretty dark assumptions about how countries interact. One of its core branches, offensive realism, argues that states just inherently fear each other.
Constant fear.
And this fear comes from three things, apparently. The anarchy of the international system, meaning no world government, no 911 to call.
Right, no higher authority.
The fact that other states have offensive military capability and the uncertain intentions of those other states, you just don't know what they're thinking.
You can never be sure.
So this constant fear, born from anarchy, weapons, and uncertainty, it forces states, logically, to try and maximize their share of world power. It's like, if you're always worried about being attacked, your best bet is to be the strongest one around.
Become the hegemon.
Yeah, the dominant power. Not necessarily to attack others, but just for your own security, survival.
It really is a zero-sum mentality. That's the key phrase. In this view, one state's gain in power is automatically another state's loss. So states are sort of predisposed to think offensively, even if their ultimate motive is just survival.
But leaders don't usually say that, do they?
No, that's what's often overlooked. There's this discernible gap, as one source put it, between how leaders frame conflicts, often as a moral crusade or an ideological contest, and the actual conduct of foreign policy, which is frequently driven by these cold, hard, realist calculations about power.
Interesting.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, realism suggests that even if states just want to be secure, the very structure of the international system, that anarchy, it pushes them towards competition. It's not about being good or bad states.
It's just survival.
It's about survival in an anarchic world.
Okay, so a key piece of realism definitely revolves around military strength, which raises a really important question. Is military strength actually a prerequisite for peace? Do you need to be strong to avoid war?
Well, the arguments for military strength often point to things like the Cold War, the buildup of nuclear weapons specifically.
Right. Mutually assured destruction, maybe.
Exactly. And for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis is sometimes used as an example, where the sheer terrifying consequences of nuclear war actually deterred conflict. The thinking was, the higher the stakes, the less likely either side was to actually act and start any violence.
Okay, but there's a pretty strong counterargument too, isn't there? I mean, while the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't escalate, the risk of total destruction was immense. We were incredibly close.
Terrifyingly close.
And interestingly, if you look at data like the global deaths and war graph we saw, it shows a noticeable decrease in deaths since the major disarmament efforts after the Cold War.
That's true. The trend is downward since then.
Now look, correlation isn't causation, obviously. There are tons of factors at play. But it certainly challenges that simple idea that more weapons automatically equals more peace.
It absolutely does.
It makes you ask what else changed. And it also reminds me of President Eisenhower's warning, about the military-industrial complex, this permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. He worried about the cost, how we spend more on military security each year than the net income of all U.S. corporations combined.
You've really hit on the core paradox there. The military that might prevent war also fuels the very conditions for it. It's a classic security dilemma.
You arm to feel safe, which makes your rival feel unsafe, so they arm more.
Exactly. Creating this perpetual state of readiness for a war nobody actually wants, that's the trap realism identifies. And Mersheimer's analysis adds to this. He notes that nuclear weapons are, quote, revolutionary, and they do make great power war less likely. But, and this is key, he emphasizes that security competition still continues. War remains a real possibility. He argues that unless one power achieves clear nuclear superiority, the nuclear balance doesn't really shift the relative power calculation much.
So what does, according to him?
It comes back to conventional forces. Armies and the air and naval forces that support them are the core ingredient of military power. Boots on the ground, essentially.
And even then, he's skeptical about how effective some types of military power are on their own, right? Like blockades or just bombing campaigns.
Very skeptical. He cites examples like the naval blockades against the UK in World War I and II, they didn't force surrender, or the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan in World War II. Devastating, yes, but not the single decisive factor in their defeat.
And what about those decapitation strategies? Trying to take out the leader?
He points to attempts against Iraq in 91, Gaddafi in 86, the Chechen leader Dudayev in 96, and says they failed all 3 times to achieve the main political objective. So, yeah, even having military might doesn't mean you can easily translate it into winning wars or achieving your goals.
Yes.
It really highlights the paradox. Deterrence can work, maybe, but it fuels an arms race. And that data on decreasing deaths after some disarmament, that's a critical counterpoint. It's always about weighing potential security against those inherent massive risks.
Okay. Realism, as we've seen, paints a pretty stark picture. It's mostly about power, fear, competition. But is that the whole story?
Thankfully, there's another major theory, liberalism, which steps in with a more hopeful lens.
Yes, a significantly different perspective.
What does liberalism emphasize as the path towards peace?
Well, liberalism still sees states as the main actors generally, but it argues that their internal characteristics matter a lot.
Like what kind of government they have. Exactly. Liberals tend to believe democracies are preferable and that a world populated by good states, usually meaning democracies, is the key to achieving peace.
Which feeds directly into that famous idea, the democratic peace theory, right? The argument that democracies just do not go to war against other democracies.
That's a central tenet, yes. So, theoretically, a world full of democracies would be a peaceful world.
Okay, what else does liberalism focus on?
It also places huge emphasis on economic interdependence. The idea here is that strong economic ties make non-military threats such as economic sanctions credible.
Oh, yeah.
And more broadly, that high levels of trade foster peace because rational states benefit hugely from trade, so they'll want to avoid conflict that would jeopardize those benefits and likely lead to retaliation. Basically, war becomes bad for business.
And we saw a pretty compelling real-world example of this, didn't we? In the sources about the American-Chinese relationship on Taiwan since 1995.
Yes, that was a key case study.
Before China really ramped up its economic reforms and became deeply interconnected with the U.S. and the world, there was an average of, 0.79 militarized interstate disputes, MEs related to Taiwan each year.
Right, nearly one major incident per year, on average.
But after the reforms, after the economic ties deepened, that dropped significantly, down to 0.26 mid-year. And the conflicts that did happen were shorter too, averaging 11.13 months versus 5.33 months.
A noticeable difference.
So even with flare-ups like China's military exercises near Taiwan, or U.S. naval movements in the mid-90s, or even the more recent trade war stuff under Trump, the overall trends seem to show conflict reduction linked to those economic ties.
It's a powerful argument for the pacifying effect of trade, for sure.
It really makes you wonder how much our wallets are keeping the peace, you know.
It does. But it also raises an important question, right? Is economic interdependence a truly unifying force for everyone involved? Is it always symmetrical?
What do you mean?
Well, while that U.S.-China data on Taiwan is compelling, some realists push back. They caution that highly asymmetric interdependence, where one side depends much more on the relationship than the other, might only restrain the weaker party. Or even worse, it could actually inflame competition for markets and resources, potentially leading back to conflict. Think about historical colonialism or imperialism, often driven by economic competition.
So trade can tie us together,
Mm-hmm.
but it could also create new friction points depending on how balanced it is.
Exactly. It's not necessarily a simple win-win all the time.
Okay, so we've unpacked these major theories. Realism's focus on power, liberalism's on democracy and economics. Now, the real test. How do these abstract ideas actually play out when we look at the major powers shaping our world today? The U.S., Europe, China, Russia.
Right. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
How do things look on the ground?
Well, it's undeniable that the relationships between these great powers, the U.S., the EU, China, Russia, Japan, they have a massive impact on international stability. When they cooperate, things tend to be calmer globally.
And when they clash?
Conflicts destabilize relations far beyond just the two countries involved, and we're definitely seeing significant power shifts right now, aren't we? And rising tension and frictions. You've got the U.S., EU, and Japan as sort of the established players.
Right.
And then Russia and China actively trying to alter the existing balance of power.
But even with all that tension, the analysis we looked at shows a distinct mix of both conflict and cooperation.
Right.
It's not all one thing.
Absolutely. Let's take the U.S. and the EU. Despite internal pressures, U.S. political polarization, various EU crises like finance, refugees, Brexit fallout, they still maintain the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship in the world.
Wow. What were the numbers?
Accounting for something like 31% of world trade and almost 49% of global GDP. Those ties are incredibly deep, even if things like the TTT trade negotiations stalled.
Okay, what about the U.S. and Russia? That seems more conflict-heavy lately.
Definitely high tensions, especially over Ukraine. That led the U.S. to significantly increase its defense budget in Europe back in 2017, citing Russian aggression. Yet even then, the official U.S. line was that it will keep the door open to cooperation if Russia respects sovereignty. It's not a complete shutdown.
And the EU and Russia.
Similar story, maybe even more complex. Russia is, or was, a huge trading partner for the EU, main destination for Russian exports, main source of EU imports, main source of foreign investment in Russia, huge economic links. But there's this deep value gap, as the source called it, EU democracy versus Russia's more conservative view of sovereignty. This has stalled cooperation agreements, and Russia often uses divide and rule tactics within Europe. Plus, Russia is seen as a natural threat by many of the EU's eastern neighbors.
Right. And then there's the big one, U.S. and China.
Yeah, the defining relationship of the 21st century, many would say. Clear geopolitical rivalry, especially in the South China Sea, military posturing, accusations of cyber attacks. Yet both sides seem determined to avoid a direct confrontation. They maintain things like the strategic and economic dialogue for broad consultations on everything from North Korea to climate change, even UN peacekeeping.
And the economic ties are massive there, too.
Absolutely huge. China is the main source of U.S. goods imports. The U.S. is China's second biggest trading partner overall. This massive economic dance creates a powerful disincentive for outright war, despite all the other tensions, the military image of the enemy on both sides, the U.S. arms embargo, mutual accusations of cyber espionage.
It's a real tightrope walk.
It is. And you see similar dynamics, though perhaps less global in scale, between China and Japan. Disputes over islands like the Diaoyu Senkaku. Japan becoming more assertive militarily, which worries Beijing and Seoul, but gets encouragement from the U.S. and Europe. That rivalry for influence is expected to continue. There's even concern that if China's economy slows down significantly, it might lead to more aggressive actions abroad to shore up domestic support.
So if we try to look at the overall stability, say, in Asia, using Mearsheimer's ideas, yeah, that's second.
Well, Mearsheimer might describe Northeast Asia currently as a balanced multipolar system. You have multiple great powers, China, Russia, the U.S., all nuclear armed. The U.S. acts as an offshore balancer, meaning it has influence but not territorial ambitions in the region itself.
Is that stable?
According to the theory, it's less stable than bipolarity, like the U.S.-Soviet Cold War standoff, but it's considered safer than unbalanced multipolarity.
What would that look like?
That would be if one power, say China, became a dominant regional hegemon. That could trigger intense fear among its neighbors, leading them to band together against it, potentially increasing the danger significantly.
So the current balance, while tense, might actually be preventing worse outcomes.
That's the realist argument, yes.
Right.
And it's where things like the U.S. troop presence come in. It's seen as playing an important role in moderating security competition and promoting stability in both Europe and Northeast Asia.
But it also carries risks, right? Like getting dragged into a conflict.
Huge risks. The analysis explicitly mentions the danger of the U.S. getting pulled into war with China over Taiwan because of its commitments and presence.
Wow. And there was that really provocative point, too.
Ah, yes. The idea from one study that the U.S. would probably become more prosperous in the event of an Asian or European war that it stayed out of,
Wow.
by potentially gaining relative power as the other major combatants exhaust themselves and their resources. It's a stark, almost chilling example of that purely realist perspective, where even cooperation or neutrality is often driven by narrow calculations about relative power, not some abstract commitment to world peace.
So, okay. After this incredible deep dive, going from superheroes to Hobbes to trade wars,
Yeah.
what does this all mean for that original question, the quest for world peace?
Well, I think we've seen pretty clearly that peace isn't some simple switch a superhuman or anyone can just flip. It's this incredibly intricate dance.
A dance between...
Between that inherent drive for power and survival that realism highlights, the deterrent effects of military strength, but also the huge risks that come with it, and then these unifying forces sometimes of economic interdependence and cooperation that liberalism emphasizes.
But those forces can be paradoxical, too, as we saw.
Exactly. So realism suggests this continuous struggle, states being forever vigilant, never putting anything above survival, not even prosperity. While liberalism offers these pathways through shared interests, democratic norms, the reality seems to be a messy, complex mix of both, constantly shifting.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Consider this. If great powers are ultimately driven by self-interest and survival, like realism suggests, and if sometimes conflicts or the threat of conflict actually force parties to enter into negotiations,
Where are you going with this?
does that imply that a certain level of tension, maybe even the constant threat of conflict, is paradoxically a necessary ingredient? An uncomfortable but maybe essential part of maintaining stability and cooperation in our world. What might that mean for the future of international relations if some tension is actually required?